den rechten.
Bir müşteri olan
Den rechten Teil an der Nordseite.
Moving forward.
Talking about mobility solutions, and we're talking about collective pathways to mobility. We had a survey that was commissioned by the Ministry of the Environment, and we looked at these emerging forms of mobility in urban peripheries. I like the word urban periphery as opposed to peri-urbia or peri-urban areas. So what are the alternative forms of mobility? What I mean is alternative solutions to individual cars. I mean, so instead of what are the other solutions? So instead of solo driving, you could have carpooling. You can, of course, have buses and collective and public transportation. If you leave that aside, what are the other solutions? So the French word tram refers to in a way, a first attempt at defining a solution, and that's what I was trying to do here. An outline. Outline for collective mobility. That's what that's the best translation for the word tram. Tram de mobilité collective. An outline of possible or avenues for possible alternative solutions. So one thing that was mentioned is carpooling. You had forms of buses for pedestrians. The idea is that you have a sort of buses on demand. That is what we call pedibus. And then we have to. I mean, these are options, and they're all thought about. But of course, how does this translate? If you really want to implement this, this would bring about consequences in terms of policies and budgets, etc. Let's see how it would work first before we suggest it. And there were a number of studies conducted, and we were able to look at people who might be resorting to alternative forms of transportation. So who would be willing? Well, you would be looking at people who are flexible, adaptable, people who would resort to older forms of transportation when they encounter new situations. So, for instance, if gas becomes too expensive, they stop driving, they use the bicycle. So it's nothing really innovative, it's nothing new, it's just resorting to old solutions that are less expensive. But here, of course, this study was done for the purpose of the corporate world, that is, employees of a company who can take a collective a bus to work, as opposed to driving their individual cars. But then you have people who are willing to literally put their feet where their mouth is, that is, start to walk and do something, and people who cannot or will not do this. And so there was a survey done by Louis Morin in the Observatory of Inequalities, and he found that there's more poverty in urban centers than in the peripheries. In most of France, the average income in peripheric areas, in peri-urban areas, is higher than in city centers. However, in rural areas, you have much more challenges. The choice is between a car and a car. And that makes things much more difficult in the truly rural areas. And so you have the different types of profiles. You have people who have strong opinions, that are activists, that are willing to go out and take the bicycle and do this, and those that simply cannot or will not do this. So you have two profiles. So there's there are personal considerations. It's not just a matter of policies. You have now that's looking at people, looking at policies, and looking at models. Now you said that the peri-urban model is here to stay. That's what has been said. We will have suburbs, peri-urbia, peripheral areas. These will be here for some time. Maybe not forever. Maybe the present peri-urban model will change, but the change is already underway. Shows that the existing model is stabilizing. Paradoxically, now all sorts of experiments are conducted, and we find that public policy is totally unprepared for this change, especially changes in transportation, and they have no policies to support alternative solutions. So that's so when you look at alternative forms of transportation, is there any knowledge, any objective knowledge? There are a few studies here and there, but say carpooling, very few people know about this. You have surveys conducted over the internet, questionnaires here and there, but it takes a lot of work. It would require a major ethnographic work to see who's doing carpooling, who the audiences are. In the winter, it's more difficult because people going home late at night want to go home. They don't want to bother with a questionnaire. So it's very difficult to gather data about carpooling and the possibilities. Then the knowledge of politicians is much more subjective. People try and get information intuitively. We have seen that a lot of that knowledge is a bit intuitive, a bit subjective. There's not much solid. But and yet, we find that politicians as well as institutions have become aware of this. They realize that for the climate plan, it is necessary to have alternatives to cars. For accessibility, and what we call pedibus is a solution. That is, find a way, for instance, rather than having cars lining up in front of the schools, you can have school buses that like we have in certain countries. So that would be a solution. Now, of course, you have to see where it can work and what is the degree of elasticity. Are these peri-urban areas flexible? They're not much flexible in morphological sense. I mean, some roads simply are not suited for public transportation. You have the width of the road for a bus. You cannot have a school bus on a narrow road. I mean, there are things like that. And there are ways, for instance, near a train station, the pavement is such that you simply cannot park either cars or buses, and so it makes it very difficult to do anything. Then, of course, it's a matter of priorities. The policies have to choose between all sorts of things. There are other priorities, and people are concerned on one hand about both public transportation and people confined or isolated, and people who live in remote or quiet areas do not like to see a train line or a bus line coming nearby, because that means nuisance, noise pollution, etc. And so there is some resistance to public transportation, not always a positive response. And then some choices are made by policymakers, but of course a decision is made, but we do not know whether it is sustainable. You start something and you don't know what will happen of it 10 years down the road. Now, in terms of urban or territorial planning, land use planning, there has to be some sort of reform to be able to take these considerations into account. Now, we have seen that in regional planning, especially around specific poles or clusters, special arrangements must be considered. But as I said, there's the issue of flexibility. And the third aspect is budgets. How can you pay for all this? Especially if you want to have a new railway line, the regional train lines, you have corridors, railway corridors that are being built. That could be an alternative solution to the dissemination versus centralized building between this model, the traditional disseminated versus central, these lines can sort of bridge the gap between the two as opposed to keeping the divide. And then it is necessary, of course, to have some planning ahead of time. There's only so much you can plan. So for carpooling, for instance, there's often a gap between supply and use. It started off spontaneously, maybe it was encouraged by institutions, but we have areas that were earmarked for carpool parking, and it was not used, or maybe it was not done properly. For instance, you have areas that enable bicycles to go to these areas, but then you have to go over a main road, and it's too dangerous, so people don't do it. I mean, there are things like that. And so it's all very well to promote carpooling, but all sorts of arrangements must be made to make it possible. And very often we find that the arrangements are not necessary and not effective. School buses, and there's been some work on that. You need to have the right balance. I mean, everybody involved in the system. You have associations, you have parents, school, children's parents, and it cannot be run by one group rather than another, because otherwise it won't work. For instance, if the school is all too present, then the school bus is seen as a service, and so paid for by the parents. And so if the school is too present, then people decide, well, you know, it's paid for by the state, whereas in fact it's paid for by the parents or associations. And so everybody's got to have a say in the running of these things. Otherwise, the attitude will not work. So school buses or carpooling have to be based on, the infrastructure, but also existing solidarities and attitudes. In other words, you can't simply rely on the technological, on the technical setup. You need to have existing arrangements, solidarities, plus you have to introduce new ways and means. It won't work all by itself. Also, it has to be, and the doors have got to be open. You can't just say, right, it's only for mobility issues. You have people who live in small towns, and they want to say, right, well, we need to have mobility for school children, but you have another type of mobility for other users. You can't have this. The doors have got to be open. Likewise, it's not just a matter of transportation. These school buses, these pity buses, can be used for other purposes, for other uses. It is for the villages to decide, or for the towns to decide what use to be made. And so it's not just for specific, say, bus routes. It will also be to promote community life. And so that sort of departitioning is necessary. And let me get back to something about, well, what was said yesterday, some of the challenges today. We have these, new forms of collective mobility. We find that there's some form of collective transportation. You have some territories that are well endowed, that have set up systems, but others who have simply been left out altogether, and areas that are not really rural, but they're neither here nor there, and they can have dual peripheries. They will have a suburban model, and here I disagree with Jacques Lévy. The word suburban that was mentioned yesterday by Martin Schuller does not really exist in France. Suburbia does not exist in France. We talk about these urban corridors. These are just emerging in France, and they are built around some form of public transportation system. So when there is this sort of mobility available, then these clusters, these urban clusters, or corridors can form. But then outside these corridors, you have places that are left out. And of course, we have to look at this, because it becomes a dual situation: those that are in and those that are out. And those that are out really present something of a challenge. And it's not just within the well-served peripheries which have public transportation. It's outside these corridors that the real issue lies. Thank you.
den Rechten.